Okay, so last week we asked ourselves the question, why would we study the book of Judges? And I appreciate what Keller said about it. It was a time when God's people daily faced a choice between looking to God as their Lord or following the spirit and preferences of their age. So it's for us perfectly. However, they failed miserably, which is why it also is a book that has been described as, quote, despicable people doing deplorable things, and also trashy details about dysfunctional people. So a little context, we are out of Egypt. Oop. What was that, a bug?
Yes.
Oh, is it a flying cockroach got you? Okay, so for context, we are out of Egypt. We've wandered the desert with Moses. We've crossed the Jordan with Joshua. And we have incompletely conquered the promised land. And now it's both been an incomplete conquering of the promised land because they failed to dislodge the Canaanites. And I specifically wrote down the tribe of Dan because Dan was supposed to take the area of what is now modern day Tel Aviv and Joppa. But remember, they couldn't dislodge those Canaanites there. So they ended up on the north, which we go visit when we go to Israel. The name of the town was Laish or Lash, whatever it was. They end up there. But it was also an incomplete conquering because sometimes they just gave up and went ahead and settled down together with the Canaanites. And in that one, I particularly think of the tribe of Benjamin in Jerusalem. They sort of shared Jerusalem with the Jebusites, and the Jebusites would remain there until David, so hundreds of years later, okay? The book of Judges sort of starts out okay. I mean, they at least seek God's guidance. They do a good job of chopping off the thumbs and toes of Adonai-Bezek, which was an interesting story. They somewhat at least cohabitate in Jerusalem, but they do capture Hebron and Debir. One of the fun facts that came out of last week I thought was really interesting is the fact that Caleb was an Edomite. I just thought that was really interesting. Now that makes him a distant cousin of the Jews, but it's interesting to me that he is fully brought in and given a position of authority in the tribes of Israel. I thought that was I never knew that, or either I knew that and forgot it and relearned it, which at my age is a great thing. You get to relearn stuff all the time, yeah. But it also furthers this sort of pet theory that I kind of developed when we went through the book of Judges, is that even though, God says you are to abstain from joining forces with the tribes around you, which doesn't make them exactly evangelical. When people and tribes say we want to be under your protection and come in under the law of Moses, they are welcomed in, and it happens quite a bit and more often than you think. It would make a good list. Anyways, then we actually wrapped up with this long, not so happy stretch that some author called it the neither and nor section, which was neither did they conquer, nor were they successful in taking over the land or whatever. Neither and nor and neither and nor. And so, unfortunately, it sort of wraps up in the first part of chapter 2 with the angel of the Lord at Bochum, which our Bible scholar, Dr. Phil Howard, gave us the firm, absolutely, this is a Christophany. This is the angel of the Lord is Jesus Christ. And he basically pronounces judgment by saying, and here's the quote that will sort of inform us, not just for the rest of the book of Judges, but I did some math on that, the next 837 years. And it goes like this: these people will be a thorn in your sides and their gods a snare for you. Now, why did I say the next 837 years? This was just me doing a little bit of math on my calculator. I basically calculated from the time of Judges starting till the end of the Babylonian captivity. And by the way, this is just me sort of off the top of my head, so I might not be completely correct on this. However, from what I understand, it was during the Babylonian captivity where there was the rise of the rabbis and not the Torah, but what's the other big book they have?
Mishnah.
The Mishnah, right? Gets formed. And it seems to be that 70 years that they're in Babylon, they really sort of develop a very Jewish identity. And it just seems to me, just from what little I know about history, from that point on, they don't really go dabbling into Baal worship. Does that make sense? Not that I can think of off the top of my head. But what I'm going to say is this. There's an 837-year period of time between Judges and them getting taken away by Babylon. And pretty much from what I understand from reading Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, they're always dealing with Asherim poles and the high places and Baal worship. And did you notice I'm really learning to say Baal? I always say Baal or Baal. That's the Hawaiian pronunciation, right? But I practiced today. I really did. I practiced today. Baal, Baal, Baal. I'm going to say Baal. I looked it up to make sure that is the correct pronunciation. It's actually Baal. Does that make sense? It's like 2 syllables. Baal. Baal. Okay? Okay, so tonight we're going to do this. It starts out with just a bit of we're almost going back in time, a little history, because we're going to go back and talk about Joshua dying for like one sentence anyways, yeah? And then the first half of the study tonight is kind of a preview about what the rest of the book of Judges is about. But again, it's kind of almost a preview of like the next 837 years, this cycle, which I'll get into here in just a second, yeah? And remember this, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping small g gods, which we'll get into in just a little bit. God had called Israel to be a holy people. Remember, the root of holy is separate, different, separate. God is creating a separate patch of turf. Now, we always kind of cringe a little bit about the fact that these Canaanites had to get tossed out. But if you kind of do the math on this, think about it. This big giant globe with people groups all over the planet. And God's like, look, I'm going to take one people and I'm going to take one geographical area and I'm going to stake my claim, and this will be my area, and these are going to be my people. And the reason why is these people are supposed to show everybody what kind of God I am, and it is through these people I'm going to bring in the one who will bring salvation to all of you on the rest of the planet. Does that make sense? It's kind of a large concept there, all in one shot. But more to say on that later, so let's go ahead and jump in. So chapter 2, we pick up in verses 6 to 9 with the brief recap. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. Remember, we covered that at the end of Joshua? And the people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnah-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Just to recap, Israel was relatively faithful under Joshua. I was sort of intrigued by this one line. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Now, we kind of have a running debate going in this class here, and I don't want to dive too deep into it. But some people have disagreed with me. I have a speculation that there was more than just Caleb and Joshua that survived the 40 years in the desert, and that many of them went on to partake in the conquering of the Holy Land, the Promised Land, I mean. And maybe it almost looks like from this verse right here, maybe some of them even outlived Joshua. I can't prove it. I don't know that we can disprove it. I thought I'd just cause trouble by saying, aha. Does that make sense? So it seems like there was some elders that stick around even after Joshua, but those who had seen. Now, possibly these are guys that maybe had seen like just the division of the River Jordan or what have you, and he's not talking about those who saw the plagues of Egypt. So, do with that as you may. Those are just those little dumb things that kind of interest me. The second part of this whole thing is about what they did is almost exactly copied from Joshua 24. 29. So whoever wrote this probably actually was familiar with the book of Joshua. And they sort of like, okay, we're going to start a new section. Let's grab that last bit of Joshua. We'll stick it right in here. But I did want to briefly, before we jump into the first cycle, I want to share with you, everybody, did you all get my email that had the cycle description on it, right? Yeah. There's a bunch of different versions that people have come up with about that cycle. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to use one by Herbert Wolf. And it's a 5-part cycle, and it goes like this. It starts with sin that leads to, because they're all S's. You know how preachers like to do that, right? All S's, yeah, it's a memory thing. Sin, which leads to slavery and oppression, which leads to supplication. Just a brief definition, supplication means a crying out for deliverance. We use it in the words, we use it as the word for prayer. Like if you're going to get on your knees for a time of supplication, that means you're going to get like, oh, you know when we pray the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, that is an act of supplication. Okay, so sin, slavery, supplication, which leads to salvation. And then he ends it with silence, which probably because he couldn't find another word that started with an S, because silence actually is not a good description. A better word to use for that is a time of peace. Does that make sense? So supposedly at this point they're serving God. In fact, serving God starts with an S. That might be a better thing than silence. What's that?
Shalom.
Or shalom. Why didn't I think of that? Let's just call it shalom. Yeah? Wow, Tom. That was good. That was good. Shaloha, Tom. Okay, so let's get into one of our first cycles of many we're going to go through in the book of Judges, verses 10 to 14. I like this. After that, whole generation had been gathered to their fathers. Okay, so that whole generation, at this point, I think I'm calling no more people from the desert time, right? We're way post-desert. We're post-Jordan crossing. Okay. That whole generation had been gathered to their fathers. Another generation who grew up who knew neither of the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals, plural. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And I think I'm going to read verse 14. Actually, let's just stop right there. Let's just stop right there. 10 of 13. Verse 13. Okay. By the way, I titled this little section NKOTB. Anybody? New Kids on the Block? Yeah. This is the next generation. Now, I'm glad I got a chuckle out of Garrett there. All right. Okay. John laughed too. Thank you, John. New Kids on the Block. Now listen, I'm going to read you something that one commentator said. And I'm going to tell you right out the gate, I completely disagree with this guy. This is what he said. He said, this new generation, they have not seen the miracles their fathers had talked about. People cannot thrive on the spiritual power of their parents. Each generation must personally experience the reality of God. Now here's what I say when I disagree about that. I don't disagree that like everybody needs to sort of experience the power of God. I'm not saying that. But I'm putting the blame on the parents for not passing down the truths of what they had experienced in the desert. This guy seems to be kind of letting them off the hook a little bit, right? You know, well, they didn't experience all the miracles of their forefathers. But does not God via Moses tell the Israelites as part of the, I forget if it's in Leviticus or is it in Numbers where he says, you know, put these verses on the door frames and on your head. And why does he say to do that? Anybody? So that your kids and your kids' kids will serve me always. And the reason why I make a big deal about that, for starters, is one of the reasons I'm so excited about what's going on around right here. Because even while I'm talking to all of you, I'm watching Anchor House kids go by, and they're going upstairs and they're going back to Anchor House. And I mentioned something a couple Sundays ago, how excited I was that family camp is now being run by a whole new generation. And this is our job. I mean, I'm looking around this room. Hokey dang. No, Jen, you're the youngest one here, aren't you? Yeah. But look at everybody in our generation except Jen. Our whole job at this point is to pass these truths on that have been passed down since Christ, all these teachings, right? And so I don't want to let those guys off. But in any case, let's move on. That's just my little pet theory on that. But this section here that we just read is the first part of the cycle. And I mean, it's just like textbook. I don't need to repeat any of that for you. You all got it. It's sin. He talks about Baals. Notice it's in the plural. So Baal himself, the main Baal, is the Canaanite storm god of rain and agriculture. But there's kind of lots of little Baals, and there's sometimes Baals that go by geography. So there's the Baal of Mishmishmishmop or whatever. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah. Now, one of the reasons that was appealing, well, there's a bunch of reasons, which we'll get into here in just a second, Baal was appealing is because being the storm god of rain and agriculture, you got to have rain, and so the temptation is, well, you know, we've been praying to Yahweh and we're waiting and no more rain. Maybe we ought to pray to Baal, or what do we got to do to, you know, sacrifice to Baal. Okay. And then the other thing that was really appealing, which we'll get into a little bit later tonight too, was, man, the people that serve Baal, they had temple prostitution and child sacrifice, which is what made it really detestable to God. But basically it meant a lot of sex without consequence, which is really appealing to people. As I say, to 21st century Americans. Sex without consequence, without having to get married and raise kids. You see why this is a problem, right? But what it leads to starts in verse 14. In his anger against Israel, the Lord, and I love this, handed them over to raiders who plundered them. Raiders. Garrett? Yeah. Raiders, yeah. Sorry, it's a football joke. Yeah. Handed them over to the raiders who plundered them, and he sold them. Oof, we got to go back to that. To their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. And whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. So, did anybody catch that? He handed them over. Why am I like so excited about that terms? Well, just about 5 days ago, I got to teach the Anchor House kids what I learned about the wrath of God from Romans chapter 1, which I will briefly go over because I know I've taught it to you guys probably 10 or 15 times now. But I was struck because Romans chapter 1 starts out saying this: the wrath of God against mankind is being revealed, right? So then he describes what the wrath of God is. First of all, he says they engage in all kinds of hideous sexual practices. They were liars and adulterers and cheaters and inventors of evil and jealousies and what do you call it? Fights? It starts with a D. Anyways, dissensions and everything. And 3 times in that section, God says, so he gave them over. He handed them over. And the reason I'll make it a real brief point, because I think I've shared this with you enough times, is I came from a model that thought God punishes you when you sin. So if you do something bad, God's up in heaven, with thunderbolts of cancer, for example, or thunderbolts of car problems, right? Right? And I say that, but just so you know, there's a good friend of mine who comes to this church who's a Reformed Catholic who still struggles. He used to say things to me like, well, I know that I better get it, I better be good because, God can give me cancer. And I'm like, that's not how it works. How it works is God hands you over. Why? Wages of sin is death. Sin is its own reward. God does not need to throw a thunderbolt of cancer at you. God just says, then go for it. And so look what happened. Isn't that fascinating? By the way, I never knew that same verbiage is in the Old Testament. I'd only known about that through Paul's description in Romans. And when I read that last week, I was like, hand it over. I love it. The wrath of God. God says, oh, fine, you want to go worship Baal? You go right ahead and watch what's going to happen, okay? Now, it says they were in great distress, and I think they could have added the word suffering to those 5 S's, right? But in this case, by the way, it is assumed then their next supplication, which actually doesn't occur till verse 18, but it leads to what's going to happen next. So verse 16, as the cycle continues, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived, for the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned, and there's the supplication, as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So this is, again, just speaking in really broad terms about what's going to be happening for the next, 837 years, let alone, especially in the book of Judges. So, by the way, in the book of Judges, just some factoids, there is a total of 15 judges, although out of those 15, 6 are rather minor judges that are just sort of mentioned, right? But most importantly to me out of this section is in verse 19 when it says they become even more corrupt. And what we're going to see in the book of Judges is this agonizingly slow, steady corruption where they're going to get worse and worse and worse, okay? And then we get to what's going to happen here, verses 20 to 23. Let's just read it. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. So there's going to be a test. By the way, this is the 3rd time since verse 11 that the anger of the Lord is mentioned. And I even noticed this. Notice it even says this nation instead of my people. Isn't that kind of like, have you ever had, your spouse say, that son of yours? It's almost like God's going, this so-called nation, no nation of mine, would, it's a small little detail, but it's true. He does say that. Now, this summary closely resembles the stern pronouncement that the angel makes at the beginning of the chapter. Remember, the angel said, this is what you're going to reap. And now we're seeing it played out already here. And by the way, all this is just a preview, really, of what's to come. This isn't one specific example. This is sort of a accumulation of all the different cycles that the Israelites are going to do. Now, it's interesting, this whole, I will test them with other nations. Now, I want to bring up this little point from the New Testament that is a really interesting thing. And I discovered this when I was studying once the book of James a long time ago, and I was doing some Greek study, and I found out something really interesting. The word in Greek is parasmos, and that's sort of the root word. It's sometimes parastis or parastos, but parasmos is translated throughout the New Testament in 3 different terms. It can be translated test or trial or temptation. Now it's interesting because the book of James says God does not tempt anyone, and yet God clearly puts people to the test. And so when I went to look it up to find out what's the deal with this word, one commentator, and I learned this, this is 1997, so a long time ago. So bear with me if I get some of the verbiage a little bit wrong, but I've remembered it all these years. He said that how they translate it differently in the New Testament is depending on who is doing the parasmos. And the reason why is this: Satan, our enemy, tempts you hoping to destroy you. God allows you to be tested to build you up. Does that make sense? And so God says, I will allow these people to put your faith to the test because I want to see, what do you got? Come on, trust me. I'm going to give you opportunities to trust me because these people will put you to the test. Okay? So it's a little foggy. It's not perfectly defined how we tell like when it is a test and when it is a trial and when it is a temptation. Because remember, James says, I praise God for when you face trials of many times. But just a few verses later, he says, but God won't tempt any of you. So, okay, bear with it as you will. Okay, so these are the people left behind to test Israel, chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. Now that's interesting because that tells us this is a new generation, right? He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. The 5 rulers of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites living in the Lebanon mountains from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath, they were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which he had given their forefathers through Moses. So this new generation had not participated in the conquest, but they were going to have to learn how to fight. And it's interesting how God will use these little nations, that was the way one guy put it, use these little nations to teach them how to go to battle, which will help them later on with Egypt and Assyria, although it doesn't go very well for them. But David, for example, not only fought the Philistines, but if you remember this, at one point he actually lived amongst them and learned their fighting techniques and their skills. Out of this list here that we have here, most of you are familiar enough with the Old Testament to know that the Philistines will be the most prevalent enemy. Remember, Get Smart? He's always battling control. The Philistines are kind of like that. It seems like 9 times out of 10, they're battling the Philistines. But they have the towns of Gaza, which is, where down by like where Tel Aviv is in the plains along the Mediterranean. Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. And a little background on the Philistines. They apparently at one point started out as sea people, kind of like the Eastern Mediterranean version of Vikings. And they were, I didn't write the date down, but I can't remember what it was. I think it was like real early, 3000 BC or something. Maybe it's 1300 BC. They were actually conquered by the Egyptians. And the Egyptians sort of put an end to their seafaring, which is when they became a land-based people. But notice they're still on the coastline because all those towns I just listed are coastal towns, yeah? The Sidonians were kind of the same thing. They were sort of the Phoenicians, but they're like the northern coastline of Israel. So like the coastal port of Sidon will feature in big time when when Solomon is building the temple. The Sidonians are still up there, yeah? The Hivites, I don't know, they're up north as well. And let me just say this, because we're going to wrap up this section and then I'll pause for comments and questions. But it says here, God gives them a chance to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands. And the commands in context of how you deal with foreign nations is don't intermarry because you will end up serving their gods. And so, verses 5 to 6, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And they took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. So they didn't do so good. Wah, wah, wah. One of the commentators I read today said, relationships affect faith. And I thought to myself, yeah, as we will see all through even all the way to Solomon, this should not be a strange idea to us. Does any of you have Jewish friends? My Jewish roommate in college, I remember his mom trying to find a nice Jewish girl for him to marry. What's that?
Using a yenta.
Using a yenta, right, to find a nice and I have lots of Jewish friends who struggled with that whole idea about who they were going to marry, and their parents all wanted them to marry Jewish friends. By the way, it's not just the Jews. I know Japanese who feel strongly the same way about that. Lauren Bunshu's parents, for example, right? But my daughter, who's off at college right now, what am I telling her? Hey, you don't have a boyfriend. Good for you. Let me give you a good piece of advice. When you're talking to guys, what am I telling her? Find a good Christian guy. Go to Young Life and go to Campus Crusade, which they don't call Crusade. What do they call it? Crew now. They call it Crew, yeah? Yeah, you're looking for a husband, looking for a boyfriend. I hope you find him amongst the believers, right? I mean, we haven't changed that much, have we, right?
YWAM.
Yeah, YWAM, yeah. And why is that? Because we've all seen it happen, right? Good Christian guy, good Christian gal starts dating a non-believer, and next thing, off they go, drifting away. In fact, one of the things I've seen actually quite a few times is that causes trouble later, because they get married, they have kids, and then the spouse that has the background of faith starts wanting to go back to church and bring the kids back. And I've seen it on both sides, the husband and the wife. And then they show up at church with the kids all on their own because, yeah, interesting, yeah? Okay, I'm going to close this section by reading these notes. Oh, here. Oh, wow. Boy, it's hard to see my highlighter pen under these lights. It turned into invisible ink. But I wanted to read these NIV notes and I want you to hear this, but I also want you to hear what these NIV notes say in the context of the world we live in today, and then I'll stop for questions or comments. Why would the people of Israel turn so quickly from their faith in God? Simply put, the Canaanite religion appeared more attractive to the sensual nature and offered more short-range benefits like sexual permissiveness, increased fertility and childbearing, and farming. One of its most attractive features was that people could remain selfish and yet fulfill their religious requirements. They could do almost anything they wished and still be obeying at least one of the many Canaanite gods. Male and female prostitution were not only allowed, but encouraged as forms of worship. Faith in the one true God, however, does not offer short-range benefits that appeal to our sinful human nature. The essence of sin is selfishness. The essence of God's way of life is selflessness. And we must seek Christ's help to live God's way. I thought that was really cool. A good way to sort of bring what was going on at that time into the modern day. By the way, one small caveat to that, when you read that little thing right there, this was from another, they also made a list. I'm not really going to read out aloud because it talks about how worshiping God is gratification postponed, while worshiping idols is self-gratification for immediate. But I'm going to spare you the whole list about all the things about serving God and serving idols. But I didn't want to read it because it was almost a little faulty, because it almost made it sound like worshiping God is no fun at all. Does that make sense? Like all it is suffering and self-discipline and what do they call that? The ascetic life, right? The monk life, the life of total denial. And I actually really don't agree with that, which is why I wasn't going to read that list out to you, because it's different. It does mean sometimes you have to deny yourself, and it does mean sometimes you've got to put in the hard work to enjoy fruits. But I also got to say this. I think living the worshipful life in the Christian life rocks. It's a life that brings more peace, more deep-rooted joy. It's a life that by design creates and flourishes relationship with other people, and long-term relationship, not relationships based on sort of lust and gratification, but long-term relationships that are built on mutual trust and honor. It involves forgiveness, and as most of you know, if you've ever had to forgive somebody, oftentimes what that does is strengthen a relationship, And so I didn't want to read that list because I didn't think it was really a good explanation of the Christian life. Okay, I've said too much. I've talked too long. Does anybody want to jump in with a question or a comment?
Yeah, that kind of lifestyle leads to nation building.
It does lead to nation building, yeah. You want to extrapolate on that a little bit?
Our forefathers, right?
Well,
they gave us the foundation, for nation building.
For nation building. So if I can extrapolate even further off of that, Dale Keene, that professor at Amherst of Religion and Politics on the East Coast, he's postulated that the nuclear family is the most successful model for nation building. It is the most economically productive model, and that the broken, divided family costs the government 16 times more than a combined nuclear family. And he's got all the social statistics that shows if you have healthy families, mothers and fathers raising their biological children, you have less crime, less drug addiction, and your kids are more prone to settle down with one spouse and raise another nuclear family. Anyways, it has all these social benefits to it. Yeah, God's way. In fact, I think most of us, I'm sort of preaching to the choir, most of us, well, I don't know how many of you tried not going God's way. Maybe you're all lifer Christians. I don't think so. In fact, I'm looking around at a few people going, I know, no, it's not so. But having lived the pagan lifestyle and now having substituted it for God's lifestyle, I can tell you, yeah, God's way rocks, Anyways, yeah. Anybody else? That was it? Nobody? Yes, Cheryl?
I don't know why, but when I walked in here tonight, I was thinking about our good Father and the fact that he is not an enabler in any sense of the word.
What do you mean enabler, though? Like,
if you're doing something you shouldn't be doing,
yeah,
he will not support you.
Yes, yeah.
And
amen.
The whole thing about the wrath of God, I always think of it as, you want to do that? Go ahead.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to support you.
Yeah.
You're just going to keep crumbling and falling down until you change your mind, but I'm not going to force you.
Yeah, if you're like super engaged in some sin and you're suffering and asking God, help me out, God's like, I'm not, like, enabler, that's a great one. I'm not going to help you. Like, do that, You're one way I've always thought about it in terms of this is if you look at God as the life source of goodness and joy and all the, the blessings of Galatians 5:22, and you go away from that, you're going away from the source of life, which is all goodness and joy and whatever. And God's always like, I'm here anytime you want to what? Repent, which means turn back. You want to come back. But if you're going away from God, whoa, come on, God, help me, bless me. He's just like, And God handed them over. He said, because until, it's almost like the prodigal son, right? I mean, the prodigal son, until he's living in a pigsty, eating pig slop, before he does what? Turns back, comes back to the source of goodness. And, anyways. Yeah, good point. Enabler. God's not an enabler. I love that. That was good. Okay, you guys. Well, let's. I wrote in my notes for the next part. Let the games begin. In fact, if anything, I'm going to start by sort of reading the introductory notes here from the NIV Life application that says this for the next part, because now we're going to actually pick up the story. We've sort of previewed what's going to happen, and so episode 1, and the NIV introduces it like this. The Israelites began a series of cycles of sinning, worshiping idols, being punished, crying out for help, being rescued by a judge sent from God, obeying God for a while, and then falling back into idolatry. They were conquered by Syria, Moab, Canaan, Midian, Ammon, and Philistia. I think that's how you pronounce that. Philistia? I don't know. They even faced the threat of civil war. Just as God sent help to the people when they cried out to him, he will deliver us when we call on him. So let's read verse 7. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Okay, so right out the gate, verse 1, they stumble, sin. By the way, Asherah, I learned a new word today, Ugaritic literature. Ugaritic literature is apparently like the cuneiform type of writing that was used for all those who worshiped Baal, which wasn't necessarily just the Philistines. It was kind of all throughout Mesopotamia, I like that word. And Ugaritic writing was the writing. And they have Ugaritic, I don't know, tablets, or I'm assuming it's tablets or writings that they have transcribed. And so they know a lot about like what I'm describing to you right now, that Asherah appears in Ugaritic literature as the wife of Baal. And Asherah was also a symbol of the goddess, a sacred tree or pole. So, you know, all throughout the Old Testament, they set up, Asherah poles? And then the good kings would go up to the high places and pull the Asherah poles down, right? Which would always be set up beside an altar to Baal. So, Baal, there I go again, right? So you've got Asherah, who's the wife of Baal, and they would put an altar of Baal and next to an Asherah pole. And these comprise what became known as the high places that we see all through Judges, but Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, okay? And then here we go, verse 8. Surprise, surprise, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them. There's another S word I guess we could use for suffering and slavery. So that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. So they're sold, slavery and suffering, all S words. By the way, the king's name seems to translate Cushan, he of double evil. So he probably wasn't a great guy to serve for 8 years, is my guess. The Israelites are not having a good time of it. By the way, something I noticed right here that I thought was a little confusing, maybe not confusing, but I thought it was interesting, and you know me, I like to find little interesting things. It says, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. And what I thought was interesting is we've just come out of this discussion of Joshua and even chapter 1 of Judges, where it described individual tribes and what level of success or not success they had in conquering their areas. And yet, right out the gate, God says, Israel, one big chunk. My guess is, knowing what I know about history and even history in the Old Testament, this is a very broad term, but my guess is different tribes were having different experiences and were sort of quote unquote conquered by this king Cushan Rishaim. Does that make sense? Yeah? That's just sort of me. So what I wrote in my notes was it's not clear historically or biblically exactly how broad this conquering was, and it's not even exactly clear where this king came from, even from archaeological evidence. And then northwest Mesopotamia. Wait, this wasn't where they came out of the city of palms. No, that's coming up in the next. That's the next story, yeah, which is Jericho. But yeah, northwest Mesopotamia. Oh yeah, that's right there in verse 8. Yeah. Even the NIV says that. Okay, so verses 9 to 10, they're going to cry out supplication and salvation. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them, an Edomite. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. And the Lord gave Cushan Rishaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. And around and around and around. Are you guys going to get dizzy or discouraged? Both D words.
Death spiral.
Yeah, death spiral, dizzy, discouraged. So God gives them Othniel, who we've already encountered as a relative of Caleb, who is actually married to Caleb's daughter, which means we can tell that this happened fairly close to the time of Joshua's death, right? So we're sort of at least in a window there. So it is a pretty quick fall away that they do. It's a fairly quick fall away from God after the death of Joshua. Othniel probably had a strong faith, being close family with Caleb, because Caleb was a super right-on guy. Obviously, Caleb's daughter was a pretty right-on gal, and she waited for a real man of God to come along. And so, good Christian, well, you know what I mean, marriage. We also note the strong presence of the Spirit of God, and this will also be a constant theme all through the book of Judges. And then we have peace. Also known as shalom, another S word, thanks to Tom.
Security.
Yeah. Oh, security. Yeah, that's another good S word to describe it, right? And then for how long was it? 40 years. Nice, good, strong biblical number. So where are we? Chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, nice name, king of Moab, power over Israel. Look at where the power came from. Isn't that interesting? From God. Getting the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of Palms. I think I was just there, Palm Springs. Yeah, it's Jericho basically. And the Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. So the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Amalekites were all nomadic raiders with great military skill. What's interesting about this, these guys aren't Canaanites, and they're not from the land of Canaan. What's interesting about that is they likely had come from the east, meaning by the time they came up from Jericho, they had already conquered the Reubenites, remember, who are living east of Jordan. Isn't that interesting? Now, the Moabites have a long history of animosity with Israel, going back to the days of Moses when they hired Balaam to curse Israel. Remember, that didn't go so well for them, yeah? And the Amalekites also opposed Israel in the desert. Now they've all joined forces, most likely defeated Reuben guys, crossed the Jordan, and now King, what's his name, Eglon or whatever, Eglon, has set up sort of his headquarters at the ruins of Jericho. And I found out something interesting today. They have apparently found archaeological evidence of this time, of the king of Eglon actually being there in the ruins of Jericho. So then an interesting thing happens, and Tim Keller, who, by the way, is becoming kind of a well-known theological rock star in the world of evangelical Christians, and gets a pretty good backing even by Dr. Phil Howard, who we were blessed to have here with us last week. He's got a really interesting take on this, and I think it's pretty good, and I want to share it with you. But let's go ahead and jump in and meet Ehud. Verse 15. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite, and the Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Brief word here about Ehud. Ehud, being a Benjamite, they would have territory out in the desert near Jericho, so they were probably pretty familiar with these nomadic tribes. And there seems to be a thing about, later on we'll find out about left-handed Benjamites. However, an interesting little factoid here. In the Hebrew translation, it doesn't say he was left-handed. It actually says he was unable to use his right hand. He might have been crippled, which is going to lead to some interesting scenarios coming up, and unable. In other words, he might have had like a withered hand, or maybe didn't have a right hand. Which, if you're familiar with how things were back in the day, that kind of handicap would sort of make him an outcast and not fit for leadership. So bear with me on that thought, and let's unpack a little bit. Well, this is what Tim Keller said. It would made him uniquely unqualified for this task because he was handicapped. But let's see what God does here in verses. We're going to read a big chunk, 16 all the way to 25. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about 1.5 feet long, which he strapped to his right thigh. Now normally a right-handed guy would strap it to his left thigh, right? Under his clothing. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. And after Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way the men who had carried it. At the idols near Gilgal, he himself turned back and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And the king said, quiet. And all his attendants, which by the way was likely his security detail, left him. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his summer palace and said, I have a message from God for you. And as the king rose, which is what you would do if you were going to get a divine oracle, right? Rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. And even the handle sank in after the blade, which came out his back. You got to love these details. This is like PG-13, right? Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. And then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked him. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked, and they said, he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the house. And they waited to the point of embarrassment. But I like that, to the point of embarrassment. Everything okay in there? Should we bring prunes and bran muffins? And then they took a key and unlocked them, and they saw their Lord had fallen to the floor, dead. Wow. Okay, let's back up a little bit. By the way, when it says when he at the idols near Gilgal, he turned himself back. Some translations, it's just stone quarries, whether it was idols or stone quarries. I don't know. It's one of those weird little details, right? But next point is, Tim Keller thinks that nobody would expect a man with a shriveled right hand to be a security threat. Because that's like, it makes him an unlikely hero of this story. Eglon would rise, which is what you would do to hear a divine oracle. And by the way, the new NIV translates this, and his bowels discharged. So I went and looked at the actual literal Hebrew translation, and it says, and poop came out.
No.
Nice detail from the Old Testament, right? And therefore, Ehud, okay, verse 26 to 30, while they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the idols or the stone quarry, and he escaped to Serah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him who was leading. Follow me, he ordered, for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands. So they followed him down, taking possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to the Moab. They allowed no one to cross over, and at that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong, and not a man escaped. And that day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had shalom for 80 years. Okay, so Ehud becomes king. This is what Tim Keller speculated, that they would have never normally followed a crippled man, except that he had clearly been chosen by God. I love it because it is yet again another episode where the least likely is chosen by God, including Moses being the mouthpiece of God, Peter being called the rock, David when he gets picked as the little shepherd boy. I mean, Jesse doesn't even show Samuel, David, right? But David, of course, is the least likely to be the leader. And now we're back to peace or shalom or silence or whatever. What else did you guys say?
Shalom.
Yeah, I think that was it. Okay, so closing thoughts with 2 minutes left to go. If we look at this as just like, what a stupid cycle, but how can we apply this to our own lives, which I think we're going to be able to do that a lot over the next 9 weeks or 8 weeks that we have left in the book of Judges, I could say. which is regarding the sin or the influence of the world around us. Tim Keller pointed out that Ehud becomes quite the hero because he takes drastic action to remove that which was causing sin in the lives of the Israelites. A great encouragement for all of us to take drastic action against the sin in our own lives, or however we might find ourselves tempted. My example that I have for you out of my own life doesn't fit perfectly. It's not, well, maybe it's a sin. I don't know how you want to look at it. But I have discovered over the last couple of years, I have taken episodes, or periods of time in my life, I should say, where I don't read the newspaper for a few days. Because I discovered it made me angry, mad, depressed, and when I say depressed, what I mean by that is sort of unhopeful. Does that make sense? Yeah? And instead of thinking like, you know what, I don't need to worry about this, God is in control, I would find myself distressed. Reading and I've been reading the newspapers since I was a little kid. I love my warm cup of coffee and reading the day and finding out what's going on in the world. But I discovered that this was like I got more stuff too. And by the way, I'm not going to give you names of any movies because I don't want to insult anybody. But there's been times when, you know, somebody has suggested a television series or a da-da-da-da. And I'm going to sound like a prude, and I don't mean to sound like a prude because that's not what I mean. But what I mean is I've watched episode 1 of like a 10-season series and thought to myself, you know, I just don't want to live in that world. Because if it's 10 episodes for 10 seasons, that's 100 episodes. And I like to binge a good series or whatever. But again, I don't mean to sound prudish. I'm just giving you an example of, I don't know if I want to go there in my brain night after night and live in that world where it's pretty foul. And just, the reason I'm telling you that, again, not to be prudish, but self-protection, right? Yeah. Self-protection. Like, I don't need that. My brother Luigi here is really onto Pure Flix. And I love the description you gave me last Thursday. This is what Lewis said. He says, you know what I love about Pure Flix? I can really relax. Like when I watch movies, I just know that, you know, it's not going to be full of foul stuff. I don't sort of have to be on my guard. I know that it's not going to take my sinful nature and my brain to places I don't want it to go. I thought that was really good.
They're not going to pull a fast one on you.
Yeah, they're not going to pull a fast
or whatever.
And isn't that true? Don't you get bummed sometimes when you're watching a movie and then all of a sudden they pull the fast one on you? Like, I think I told you about how bummed I was. You guys remember? It was a good series too. What was the chess one? Queen's Gambit. The Queen's Gambit. Which, by the way, was pretty good. Not super foul, whatever. I mean, not great, whatever. Great movie. And then right at the very last episode, they just crap all over Christians. And it was so depressing because the gal had been raised in an orphanage that was run by Christians and Christian charity, right? And then at the last, 20 minutes of the last episode, they just crap all over Christians and they present them as puritanical, judgmental, and she has to sort of diss the judgmental Christians to be set free to go win the chess thing. And I'm like, where did that come from? It had nothing to do with the whole rest of the series. It was almost like they got to a certain point and some producer said, you know, we haven't crapped on the Christians yet in this series. We better bring in some judgmental Christians that everybody can agree that we hate and show her to be more enlightened. It was really a bummer.
And the whole thing was fictional anyway.
I know, the whole thing was fictional. They didn't need to do it. And they totally missed the obvious thing that it was through Christian charity that she had learned to play chess in the first place. Whoops. Oh well. Okay, I've talked too much. Are we all done? Let's pray. Father God, Lord, thank you for this just first 2 episodes to show us the dangers of sort of dabbling in the ways of the world around us, God. And we've got a lot more hard lessons to learn, and we say, bring it on, Lord. I pray, God, by the power that we've talked about tonight of your Holy Spirit, Lord, you would be using these verses to illuminate our own lives, God, that we would see the so-called quote unquote high places in our own lives, God, where we sort of succumb to the easy way around us of the world, Lord, and we'll be inspired, God, to truly embrace the worshipful life that you have for us. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen?